So it's a funny thing being a minister. Funny for a lot of reasons. One of them, that a lot of our work in a religious community is defined by this kind of dynamic, creative tension between things that can sometimes seem to be at odds with one another. The title of the sermon, Love and Justice, doesn't imply that love and justice are mutually exclusive. You'll no doubt guess my argument is that they're intimately related. But we have this interesting, dynamic, creative tension in a community like ours between making sure that every single human being who comes into the walls of this congregation has an experience of being loved, whole, precious, and good enough just as they are, and that every human being who enters this congregation is challenged to be better than they ever thought they could be. Sometimes within the confines of the same Sunday morning. It is a dynamic tension, I think, in any religious congregation between being good enough and being challenged to do more good. But I think probably for us, this tension is especially acute because 90% of Unitarian Universalists came from somewhere else. Usually a congregation we hear reported by visitors that told them that in some way they were not good enough as they were. Innately flawed as a human being, not loved because of the body they wear or the sexuality that identifies who they are. And so many people come into our congregations from a place of feeling that they're not good enough as they are in a world which often preaches the same message. And yet, many people come to this church specifically because we're the religion who says we can be honest about our shortcomings and failings. Thank you very much. We have work to do in the world. Let's go do it. And so you will no doubt guess that we have people in the church who often come up to us and say, could you please preach less about social justice and all the ways we need to change and be active in the world? I need to hear that I'm loved and good enough as I am. And they're right. And we have people who come to us regularly and say, could we please stop talking about how good we are? There's work to do. Let's go do it. And they're right. We're in a creative tension. One of the things I like about the story from Kate Braystrip this morning is that it's not a traditional story of someone simply being told that they're good and loved as they are, nor is it a story about someone with on a picket line with a sign or in the halls of a senator's office working in justice work in a traditional sense. But I think it speaks to the way that Unitarian Universalists know how we're called to be for one another. She talks about her kids having these transitional love objects, a blanket that gets eaten down until it's the size of something that fits in your hand, a doll that's loved so hard that it looks like a wind chime. And then she mentions that experience of being with a woman telling her that her husband is not going to come home. These moments, sharing news like that with people, are incredibly difficult. That story resonated with me in the moments where I've had those experiences of telling someone the person you love is not coming home. She talked about the body against her feeling hot with grief. That made sense to me. The hands wrapped tightly around her, the bodies falling down on the ground together. And she says, I'm a transitional love object. I'm Blanky, I'm Rab, I'm Jesus. What a privilege it is to be so used, she says. I think it's a very you story. It's two human beings, flesh and blood, in the room trying to love one another for the precious beings they are in difficult moments. But for me, I see a woman who was of service to someone else because she was being loved. And I think that's a very you way of understanding how we're of service to people in the world. That we're freed to be good and loved for others when we experience being good and loved. Like the hymn said, by this we worship and are freed. who have this long history of connecting being good with doing good. Our Unitarian ancestors on one side were Christians who said, Jesus is most likely a human being who has these teachings to us, other human beings, and we're not depraved. Their major argument was actually not about the Trinity, first off. It was about humanity. They said, we're not depraved, we're innately good, and that's what makes us moral agents in the world. The stories we read in the Bible and other texts are not about a God so far above us that we can't live up to this. This is a human story for humans, challenging us to be as good as we actually are. And then the Universalists on the other side of our history were people who argued that the love of the infinite creative force in the universe was so vast it could never leave any part of creation out of relationship. I've mentioned this line a dozen times in this church, but it bears repeating. Hosea Ballou, in 1805, a young minister at the time, wrote, "In the relationship between God and human beings, God is not the dissatisfied party." Yeah. 1805 now. In the relationship between God and human beings, God is not the dissatisfied party. Now, what this meant was that the whole purpose of religion was flipped around for us. Religion wasn't about affirming your worth in the eyes of the infinite. It was not about securing yourself a place in heaven. Religion changed for us from being about getting people into heaven to being about getting heaven onto the earth. The Universalists got involved in efforts for women's suffrage. They got involved in the abolition effort because they said we're already good. Our calling is to be good for others. Now, of course, our religion learns as much about what goodness is from the Hubble telescope as we do from the book of Genesis. As Daniel mentioned last week, here we are in this world where we look out and know that every atom in your body except for hydrogen was created when a dying star exploded billions of years ago. If a huge cloud of hydrogen gas exploded and made the universe billions of years ago, then you and I were literally the same thing once. It's amazing. We're learning that each and every atom of the universe is intimately related to each other, that one change can affect something far off. We're learning that built into the very fabric of the universe is the notion that you are not alone, that you were something else and you will be something else, that in a very real sense, you're not your own. We don't even own ourselves. I think that's the lesson that my friend Joanna was writing about in the first reading this morning. Her daughter had had cancer twice by the time she was 4 years old. And the Make-A-Wish Foundation sends her to Disneyland, and she finds out that these strangers, who don't know her daughter, have been working diligently with their own time and money to provide her children with special objects of clothing to wear. She found out that a complete stranger had a vested interest in the well-being of her child. And she said that once she discovered that, she could never be the same again. She said that's when she thinks she became a Universalist for the first time. She said, being loved by someone I didn't know told me I can't spend my life being judge and jury of everyone anymore, deciding who deserves my service, who deserves justice, who deserves my concern. If they need it, they've got it. How could I be loved in this way and not be asked to change, she said. I think what Joanna's pointing to is that for people who are good and loved, we're called to remember that love has implications. Being loved has requirements. A word that Unitarian Universalists don't throw around all that much in our religious life, requirements. But love is a relational thing. If you matter to someone. You matter to somebody. Your body matters to somebody. Love is maturational. It says, yes, you're good enough just as you are, and yes, I expect you to grow and change. I met my wife when I was 19, and I imagine she loved me as I was, and she would be very disappointed if most of our life was spent with me acting as I did when I was 19. She loves me as I am, and I love her as she is, but we've made a promise about how we intend to be with one another, and that requires a lot of work. And one of love's requirements is that love is an embodied thing. We've always said we're a religion of deeds, not creeds. You can say or think whatever you want, and if you don't behave as if every human being is worthy of love and justice, our words and thoughts mean little. Love's an embodied thing. That's why when we talk about justice in this church, we talk about people's bodies, whether they have enough to eat, whether they have a home to sleep in at night, whether they have reproductive justice, whether they have health care rights, whether or not they're discriminated against because of the skin they wear or the body they inhabit or the sexuality that defines them. Justice is an embodied thing. And what Joanna was talking about was the growing realization that we're called to be in this relationship of love with people we might not ever meet. It has to extend beyond these walls. How could we lift up the teachings of a homeless rabbi on Sunday and not work for people who live without homes on Monday? We can't sit in this sanctuary and say that every human being on the face of this planet is worthy of love and justice and not back it up with our actions. Cornel West, the African-American intellectual and theologian and preacher, often says, justice is what love looks like in public. I like that. Because it says that if we say everyone deserves love and an equal share of the common good, then it can't just be something we say. Yes, you are good and holy and loved just as you are. And yet I think for our tradition, we're called to remember that love has requirements. But I also think that somewhere where we fall short is in remembering that justice has joy. I cannot tell you how many absolutely terrible invitations I've gotten to participate in justice work. They usually sound a lot like this. The world is terrible and nobody apart from me and a few friends cares about this. But if you show up and give a lot of your time and money, in a few years you can be terribly isolated, burnt out, and as cynical and angry as I am. Maybe those aren't the exact words, but that's what I've heard dozens and dozens of times in this church and in others. If somebody told me, I'm inviting you into this work because we're living the life we were called to be together, infinite, holy, precious creatures of one vast mystery. When you engage in this work, I promise you you'll know how much you matter because you're participating in building the beloved community on earth. Have you ever known how much you mattered until you worked to make sure that no child in this city will die because their parents are poor? Did you know how much you mattered when you can work to make sure that every single person living in this city has a decent meal a couple times a day? I'm inviting you into this work of justice because this is the people we were meant to be, loving, precious, and together. If that was the invitation I received, I would have said yes a lot more often than I have. So for those of us in this congregation who wish we talked a lot more about being loved and good, yes. And please don't forget that being loved and good has implications. And for those of us who want so badly for us to preach and talk and act around issues of justice more often, yes. And please don't forget to include joy in the invitation. You see, if you participate in this church for a number of years, you're going to feel that tension. And if you do, it means it's working. If it tingles. If on a Sunday morning you find yourself saying, boy, I wish we didn't have to hear so much about X, it's working. If on a Sunday morning you find yourself with those tensions, please remember that the sermons you wish we preached a lot less of are exactly what the person sitting next to you in the pews had to hear today. Please remember that this community will always be here for you and not only for you. Please remember that if we're doing our job right, you will disagree with us. If you want to be a part of a church where you never hear anything that you disagree with, join a creedal church where everyone professes the same belief. But this is not that church. In this congregation, in this faith tradition, you will be comforted in moments when you need it, and you will be made uncomfortable in other times, and that's doing our job. We have this interesting tension between nurturing the spirits of the people who come into this place and learning our responsibility in healing a world that is often broken. Sometimes it means that we hold picket signs in front of an elected official's office. Sometimes it means that we are partnering with homeless brothers and sisters in this city. Sometimes it means we're writing letters of petition. And sometimes it's lying on the floor, holding a body hot with grief, or being held, being physical evidence to the human being in front of us that we are good and loved. And what a privilege it is to be so used. And all the work that you're invited to do in this place. Good luck and many blessings on you all. Amen.